For nearly half a century, the Grand Ole Opry was her sanctuary. To millions of fans, Jan Howard was the epitome of grace, a golden voice of country music with timeless duets with Bill Anderson. But few knew that behind every note, every smile on stage, was a soul with scars that would never heal. Her life was a sad song, where the glory of her career was overshadowed by the darkness of devastating personal tragedies, the loss of two sons, the breakup of her marriage, and the decline of her fame. This is the story of an Opry legend who lived through pain more tragic than the saddest love songs she ever sang. To understand the steel in Jan Howard's spine, one must go back to the place and time that forged it. In 1929, Lula Grace Johnson was born into a world of grit and scarcity. She was the 8th of 11 children. Her world was not one of stage lights and applause. It was one of patched clothes, homegrown food, and the quiet, constant hum of hardship. Her parents were proud, deeply religious people who instilled in their children a formidable work ethic and an unshakable sense of resilience. There was no room for self-pity when there were chores to be done and younger siblings to care for. In this world, escape was a precious commodity. For young Lula Grace, it came in the form of the crackle of a battery-powered radio. Late at night, she listened to the distant magical sounds of the Grand Ole Opry emanating from Nashville. Roy Acuff and Ernest Tubbs' voices were more than singers. They were messengers from another universe, a universe of bright lights and heartfelt stories, and a life beyond Missouri. It was a dream so far away, so grand and unimaginable, that she probably never dared to speak it. Such dreams were a luxury she could not afford. Life demanded practicality, and for a young woman of her time and place, that meant marriage, stability, a life of her own. So like many girls of her generation, she married young. In 1945, at the age of 16, Lula married Merrill Wood, a decision her mother urged as a way out of their abject poverty, though it felt more like a grim end to her childhood than a bright beginning. She later captured the weight of the moment in her own words. I felt like I was preparing for a funeral, the funeral of my childhood. Dropping out of high school thrust her straight into adult responsibilities, and she soon started a family. Sons Jimmy in 1947, Carter, affectionately called Corky, in 1950, and David in 1953. But stability was a myth. Merrill took them across the states, starting in Missouri, then Colorado and Kansas, pursuing Air Force contracts and other ephemeral jobs. Money was tight, affairs were exposed early, and tempers flared into violence. The final straw came one terrible night in 1953 when an enraged Merrill held a knife to her throat, forcing Lula to grab her sons and flee. These were not the frivolous choices of a young girl in the prime of her life. They were the desperate efforts of a young woman trying to find her place in a limited world. Each marriage is a hope for a different future, and each divorce is a lesson in independence. In her 20s, Lula Grace is a single mother of 3 young boys, Jimmy, Corky, and David. The Opry dream is buried, a forgotten whisper from childhood. The new reality is about survival, about providing for her sons, about finding the strength to get through each day. To do that, she knows she must leave the world she once knew. With her 3 boys, she packs up what little she has and heads west to the vast, indifferent city of Los Angeles, hoping to find not a dream, but simply a job. Los Angeles in the 1950s was a city of dizzying contrasts. It was a land of Hollywood glamour, of movie stars and endless sunshine, but for a single mother from Missouri with no connections, it was a concrete jungle. Jan, still known as Lula Grace, took any job she could find. She waited tables, worked as a secretary, anything to feed her sons. The world of music was another universe. Still, her childhood love of stories and melodies lingered. She had a gift for words, a way with words that could capture emotion perfectly. She would write short poems, musical pieces, private thoughts on napkins during breaks. They were just for her, a small creative escape from real life. Then came the moment that changed everything, a moment born not of ambition, but of necessity. A friend of hers, an up-and-coming songwriter, needed a demo to pitch a song to country star Wynn Stewart. A demo required a singer. Lula Grace, with her clear, honest voice, was the only choice. She stepped forward, not as a performer, but as a favor to a friend. But someone else heard that tape. That someone was Harlan Howard. If you don't know the name Harlan Howard, you know his songs. He was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest country songwriters who ever lived. He was the man who wrote I Fall to Pieces for Patsy Cline, Heartaches by the Number for Ray Price, and Busted for Johnny Cash. Harlan Howard didn't just write songs. He crafted the very pillars of the country music canon. He had a gift for taking complex, painful emotions and distilling them into 3 minutes of devastating truth. He once famously described country music as 3 chords and the truth, and he was its most eloquent truth teller. When Harlan heard Lula Grace's voice on that cheap demo tape, he heard something beyond the amateur recording. He heard a voice that wasn't trying to be fancy or polished. It was a voice that sounded like it had lived. He was intrigued not just by the voice, but by the woman behind it. He sought her out, and when they met, the connection was immediate and electric. Here were 2 people who understood the language of heartache, who had both known struggle and were now orbiting the world of music. Harlan was captivated by her quiet strength, her raw talent, and the poetry she wrote in her spare moments. He saw past the waitress and the single mother. He saw an artist. He told her, "You're a songwriter who doesn't know it yet." It was Harlan Howard, a rising musician in Los Angeles at the time, who saw real potential in Lula Grace Johnson. He noted that Lula Grace Johnson was a nice, down-to-earth name, but it didn't have the appeal to shine in the booming world of country music. Harlan felt that the name lacked the sparkle, the star power that would make audiences remember it and producers take notice. So he suggested Jan Howard, a short, memorable name that sounded more modern and professional, as if it were born to stand on the Grand Ole Opry stage or make it onto the Billboard charts. More than just a cosmetic change, the name change reflected Harlan's flair for artistry. He understood that in the Nashville music industry, he was about to dominate. A name was more than a label, it was a brand, a key to opening doors. This marked the first turning point, transforming Lula Grace from an ordinary woman into Jan Howard, a symbol of feminine power in country music. Harlan did more than just change her name. He also acted as a teacher, a dedicated guide to Jan's hidden talent. He realized that the poems she had scribbled in her lonely moments, caring for 3 children from a previous marriage, were actually rough gems that could be polished into emotional lyrics. Harlan encouraged her to turn them into songs, teaching her how to structure the lyrics, combine melodies, and even sing them to get the rhythm. One memorable moment was when Harlan overheard Jan singing while washing dishes in the kitchen. Her voice, with its smooth, natural vibrato, surprised and deeply impressed him. He immediately taught her to sing "Mommy for a Day," which he had just written, and they recorded a simple demo. The demo not only boosted Jan's confidence, but also became a big hit for Kitty Wells in 1958, proving that Harlan's advice was not just empty words. In doing so, he unleashed Jan's creative potential, turning her personal verses into artistic assets, and helped her break into the professional world, where many of her later hits, such as "The One You Slip Around With," 1960, and "Evil on Your Mind," 1966, were either written or assisted by Harlan himself. The love story between Harlan and Jan was not just a romantic story, but a whirlwind of creative energy and burning passion, where personal love was closely intertwined with artistic desire. After only a month of dating, they impulsively drove to Las Vegas to get married on May 11th, 1957, a quick but passionate decision that reflected the free and adventurous spirit of both. This marriage not only united two people, but also two strong artistic souls. With this marriage, Jan Howard suddenly entered a whole new world, no longer a single mother from Missouri. Now she was the wife of Harlan Howard, Nashville's most respected musician. For a while, she was content to be his muse, his partner, the first person to hear the legendary songs that would pour out of him. But Harlan saw more in her. He pushed her to step into the spotlight herself. With his connections, he got her a record deal with Challenge Records. Her first single was a song she had co-written, a song that was pure, classic country and incredibly bold for its time. It was called The One You Slip Around With. In an era where female singers were expected to be demure sweethearts or wronged victims, Jan sang from the perspective of the other woman, a character painted not as a villain, an unapologetic homewrecker, but as a woman caught in the tangled web of a love triangle. The song was a statement. It was complex, emotionally mature, and it announced that Jan Howard was not just another girl singer. The success of that first single was modest, but it was a start. It got her noticed. The next few years were a blur of recording sessions and small tours. She was learning the business, finding her footing as a performer. But the real turning point, the moment that would launch her into the stratosphere of country music, came when she and Harlan finally made the move from the West Coast to the one place a country star truly had to be, Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville in the 1960s was Music City, USA, a magical insular town where the deals were made on golf courses and the hits were written in small offices on Music Row. It was the home of the Grand Ole Opry, the mother church of country music. For Jan, arriving in Nashville was like finally coming home to a place she had only ever dreamed of. With Harlan's reputation preceding them, they were instantly country music royalty. Their home became a legendary gathering spot for the industry's biggest names. Songwriters like Chris Christopherson and Willie Nelson would sit in their living room, trading lines and testing out new melodies. It was an intoxicating creative environment, and Jan was at its very center. She signed a new contract with Decca Records, a major label, and her solo career began to gain momentum. She had a string of hits like Evil on Your Mind, a fiery Grammy-nominated anthem that became her signature solo song. It was another track that showcased her unique ability to portray strong, complex women who weren't afraid to speak their minds. But country music has always had a deep love for duets, the magical chemistry of a male and female voice, blending in harmony. And in Nashville, a masterful duet partner was waiting in the wings for her, Bill Anderson. Whisperin' Bill Anderson was already a huge star. He was a prolific songwriter and a beloved performer known for his soft-spoken narrative style. When he and Jan first sang together, the chemistry was undeniable. Their voices complemented each other perfectly. His gentle conversational delivery was the ideal counterpart to her clear, powerful, and emotionally resonant tone. Their first major duet, I Know You're Married, But I Love You Still, was a smash hit, a classic tale of forbidden love that tore up the country charts. From that moment on, Jan Howard and Bill Anderson became one of the most iconic duet pairings in country music history. For the better part of a decade, they were inseparable on the charts and on the road. They released hit after hit. For Loving You, if it's all the same to you, someday we'll be together. Their on-stage chemistry was so palpable that fans inevitably speculated about a romance, but they were first and foremost consummate professionals and dear friends. They toured the country together, became regulars on television, and their sound defined an era of country music. For Jan Howard, this was the dream realized beyond her wildest childhood fantasies. She wasn't just listening to the Opry on a crackling radio anymore. She was a regular guest performer on its sacred stage. She was a bona fide star, nominated for awards, beloved by fans and respected by her peers. Her sons were growing up proud of their famous mother. Her marriage to Harlan, the man who had discovered her, was the bedrock of her world. From the outside, her life was a picture of perfect, hard-won success. It was the sunshine she had been chasing her whole life, but the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. And as the 1960s drew to a close, an unimaginable darkness began to gather on Jan Howard's horizon, a storm that would tear her perfect world apart. The late 1960s were a tumultuous time in America. The country was fractured, divided by the escalating war in Vietnam. Nightly news broadcasts brought the grim realities of the conflict into living rooms across the nation. The draft was a specter that haunted every family with a draft-age son. For Jan Howard, that specter became a devastating reality. Her eldest son, Jimmy, was drafted into the Army in 1967. She was, like millions of mothers, terrified. She was proud of his willingness to serve, but a primal fear gripped her. She later said, "From the day he left, I had a feeling of dread that I could not shake." Jimmy was drafted into the Vietnam War in the spring of 1968, part of a massive draft by the U.S. government to replenish troops in the escalating war after the Tet Offensive earlier that year. Jimmy was just 21 years old, a student at Middle Tennessee State University, MTSU, when he was drafted, and he received basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, before being assigned to the 196th Infantry Division, part of the 196th Infantry Brigade of the Americal Division, a unit known for its counterinsurgency operations in South Vietnam. The draft decision reflected the larger historical context. 1968 was the height of American involvement in Vietnam, with more than 500,000 U.S. troops stationed and thousands dying each month, putting millions of American families in constant fear. For Jimmy, being drafted into the Army was not only a national duty, but also a personal burden, especially when his younger brother Carter volunteered to join up so that if Jimmy goes, I go, creating a double family tragedy for Jan, whose mother had gone through 2 failed marriages and was trying to build a music career. Before leaving, Jimmy was allowed to return home for 21 days, thanks to the intervention of DJ Ralph Emery and Congressman Richard Fulton, a brief but precious time for him to say goodbye to his family, although Jan later recalled that he had sat by her bedside the night before the flight at 3 a.m., expressing his deep anxiety and uncertainty about the war, a conversation that reflected the vulnerability of youth to the violence of war. Throughout his time in Vietnam, Jimmy wrote home to his mother regularly. Letters that were not only emotional but also filled with the extraordinary courage of a young soldier trying to reassure a deeply anxious mother, who he knew was struggling with the pressures of a music career and the responsibility of raising 3 sons. The letters often described daily life on the battlefield, from rare moments of peace to potential dangers, but were always written in an optimistic tone, emphasizing family love and the hope of returning in order to ease Jan's psychological burden. But around mid-1968, Jimmy's letters stopped abruptly, creating a silence that lasted for weeks, even months, and each passing day added to Jan's gnawing anxiety, an invisible fear she later described as a heart trapped in hell. Then came the moment every military family fears more than anything else. It was a hot day in August. Jan was at home in Nashville. Two uniformed military officers appeared at her door. She said she knew the moment she saw them. She didn't even have to hear them say it. Her son, Private First Class James L. Howard, had died in combat. He was only 21. The world stopped. The music, the applause, the glittering life she had built, it all dissolved into a fog of incomprehensible grief. For Jan, the only way she could process the pain was to do the one thing she had always done. She wrote. She didn't try to write a song. She simply sat down and wrote a letter to her lost son, pouring out all the love, the pride, the anger, and the unbearable sorrow that was consuming her. She wrote about his childhood, about the man he had become, about the senselessness of his death. She took this raw, intensely personal letter to her record label. She told them, "This is not a song. I don't want to sing it. I want to read it." It was an unheard of request, a spoken word track nearly 5 minutes long, filled with a mother's raw grief, was not exactly commercial material, but her producer, the legendary Owen Bradley, understood. He recognized the profound power in her words. They recorded it simply with a gentle funereal backing track. The result was a piece of audio so harrowing and so real it transcended music. It was titled simply, "My Son." The track begins with the sound of military drums and a bugle playing taps. Then Jan's voice, thick with emotion but steady and clear, begins to speak. "My son, I'm writing you this letter, and I'm hoping that somehow you'll be able to hear me." She goes on to talk about the day he was born, about his first steps, about how proud she was of him. Then her voice cracks as she describes the moment the soldiers came to her door. The recording is almost unbearably intimate. You feel as if you are in the room with her, a witness to her private agony. When "My Son" was released, the reaction was overwhelming. It wasn't a hit in the traditional sense. You couldn't dance to it, and many radio stations were hesitant to play something so somber, but it touched a nerve deep within the American psyche. The record label was flooded with letters and calls, not from fans, but from other Gold Star mothers and fathers, from soldiers, from families who finally felt that someone understood their unique and terrible pain. The Pentagon itself called Jan, with a general thanking her for giving a voice to the sacrifice of so many. "My Son" became more than a recording. It became a sacred text for a generation of grieving military families. It was the most important work of her life, born from her greatest tragedy. She tried to carry on. She returned to the stage, to the Opry, to her life. But the grief was a constant companion, a shadow that never left her. Her marriage to Harlan, which had once been a source of strength, began to crumble under the immense weight of their shared sorrow. They grieved in different ways, and the chasm between them grew wider. And then, just as she was learning to navigate her life with one piece of her heart missing, fate delivered another, even crueler blow. Her youngest son, David, had always been more sensitive, more troubled. He had struggled to cope with the loss of his older brother, a loss that had shaken the foundation of their family. In the early 1970s, only a few short years after Jimmy's death, David took his own life. This loss was, in some ways, even more complicated and painful. The finality of suicide leaves behind a torturous legacy of guilt and unanswered questions for those left behind. To lose one son to war is a tragedy. To lose a second to despair is a devastation from which many people would never recover. Jan Howard was now a woman who had buried 2 of her 3 children. The sunshine that had defined her success was now almost entirely eclipsed by shadow. She spoke about this period later in her life with a haunting clarity, saying, you don't get over it. You just get through it. One day at a time, you get through it. The cumulative effect of these tragedies was too much for her marriage to bear. In 1973, she and Harlan Howard divorced. The great love story, the creative partnership that had launched her career, was over. She was alone, navigating a landscape of grief that few could ever comprehend. She continued to work. Music was the only life she knew. She kept touring with Bill Anderson, kept performing at the Opry, the one constant in her life. In 1971, she had been officially inducted as a member of the Grand Ole Opry, a lifelong dream come true. Now that honor felt more like a lifeline, a reason to get up on stage and keep putting one foot in front of the other. But the world of music is notoriously unsentimental. As the 1970s wore on, the Nashville sound was changing. The traditional country of Jan's era was being replaced by the outlaw movement of Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, and then by the slicker, pop-influenced sound of the late 70s and 80s. For a traditional country artist, especially a woman in her 40s, the landscape was becoming increasingly hostile. Her record sales began to decline. The hits with Bill Anderson dried up. Her record label eventually dropped her. This is a quiet kind of tragedy that happens to countless artists. It's not a dramatic scandal or a sudden fall from grace. It's a slow, painful fade. It's the phones that stop ringing, the tour dates that become scarcer, the feeling of being a relic in an industry that is relentlessly focused on the new and the next. For Jan, who had already lost her sons and her husband, the loss of her career felt like the final blow. The one thing that had given her an identity, a purpose, a way to channel her pain, was now slipping through her fingers. She also found love again. She married a Nashville surgeon named Mo Saffels in 1990, a stable and loving partnership that provided a peaceful harbor after decades of storms. And she began the painstaking, emotionally draining process of writing her life story. In 1987, she released her autobiography, Sunshine and Shadow, My Story. The title was perfect. The book was a raw, unflinching account of her life, from the poverty of her childhood to the heights of fame and the depths of her grief. She didn't spare herself or the reader. She wrote with breathtaking honesty about her son's deaths, her divorce, and her struggles with depression. The book was a critical success, praised for its candor and its powerful portrayal of resilience. It was another act of turning her pain into a source of strength and connection for others. But perhaps her most enduring legacy was her role at the Grand Ole Opry. Even when she wasn't on the radio, she was always at the Opry. For over 45 years, she was a constant presence backstage and on stage. She became the Opry's unofficial matriarch, a living link to its golden era. Younger artists would seek her out for advice, for a story about Harlan or Patsy Cline, or just to be in the presence of a legend. She was the institutional memory of the place, a walking, talking piece of country music history. She had seen it all, the triumphs, the tragedies, the changing faces and sounds, and she was still there, a steadfast and graceful pillar. She passed away in March 2020 at the age of 91, leaving behind an unforgettable legacy of music and vitality. The woman who began life as Lula Grace Johnson from West Plains, Missouri, lived a life more dramatic, painful, and ultimately inspiring than any country song ever written. She lived through the deepest darkness, but she never stopped looking for the sunshine. And in doing so, she became a beacon of light for countless others lost in the darkness. Jan Howard died on March 28, 2020, at her home in Gallatin, Tennessee, a small town not far from Nashville, where she spent much of her musical career. She passed away just 15 days after her 91st birthday. During her career, she overcame numerous personal challenges, From failed marriages and family tragedies to her remarkable achievements in country music. The cause was pneumonia, a common respiratory illness that often affects older people. Fans, mostly from the generation that loved classic country music from the 1960s and 1970s, expressed their grief in a series of posts, comments, and shares, often in conjunction with honoring her musical legacy and emphasizing her role as a resilient woman in a male-dominated music industry. Jan Howard sang the saddest love songs, but she lived an epic of strength. Her greatest glory was not in the charts, but in getting up every time she fell, stepping on stage, and never stopping singing.